Drew had always prided himself on his peaceful suburban lifestyle. A long day at work meant retreating to the comfort of his quiet home, where his prized possession awaited: his backyard pool. It wasn't just a pool to him. It was an oasis, a place where he could escape the world and recharge. It was a symbol of everything he had worked hard for, something sacred. Living in a tight-knit neighborhood with a HOA, Homeowners Association, had its perks, but it also meant dealing with certain personalities, and none more grating than his next-door neighbor, Betty. To say that Betty was a Karen would be an understatement. She had a way of using her connection to the HOA like a weapon, manipulating situations to get what she wanted. It started small. A casual chat with Drew where she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had the right to use his pool whenever she wanted. Drew, trying to keep the peace, shrugged it off. It wasn't a big deal, until it became one. Over time, Betty's presence in his pool area became a regular nuisance. She'd waltz in uninvited, her head held high, as if her position within the HOA meant she was above the rules. Drew, a kind and patient man, would politely ask her to leave. Yet, every time he did, she'd give him a condescending look and use her position as a shield, claiming it was her right as an HOA member to access the pool. The audacity of it all began to eat at Drew. His private sanctuary, the one place he could find peace, was now a playground for someone who seemed to believe rules didn't apply to her. His patience, once boundless, started to wear thin. Drew wasn't confrontational by nature, but Betty's disregard for his boundaries began to feel like a constant assault. What once felt like a mild inconvenience began to feel like an invasion of his home and his personal space. It wasn't just the pool. Betty's entitlement seeped into every corner of his life. She'd call him to complain about the most trivial things, nitpicking over lawn care or noise levels, always wielding the HOA's rules like a sword. And each time, Drew would comply, trying to avoid conflict, but it felt like he was being drained. But it was her boldness with the pool that ultimately pushed Drew over the edge. One afternoon, after a long day at work, he came home to find Betty again lounging in his pool. He stood at his back door, watching her with mounting frustration. She looked so smug, so entitled. It wasn't just the pool anymore, it was the principle of it. She thought she could take whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, without consequence. Drew had had enough. The pool, once a peaceful refuge, now felt like a symbol of everything that was wrong in his life. Betty had crossed the line, and Drew knew it was time to put an end to it. He wasn't going to let her walk all over him anymore. The sight of Betty lounging in his pool that afternoon was the final straw. Drew stared at her from the kitchen window, his fists clenched, his heart pounding. For weeks, he had tried to stay calm, tried to handle the situation with patience. But this was too much. Betty's presence in his pool felt like an invasion, a daily reminder of how she was taking advantage of his kindness. This time, Drew knew he couldn't just ask her to leave. He needed something more, something that would put her in her place once and for all. He picked up his phone, dialing the number of his old friend, Marcus. They had known each other for years, and Drew knew he could count on him. Marcus ran a reptile business, specializing in exotic animals, and had a knack for creating all sorts of lifelike props. Drew had the perfect idea. "Marcus," Drew said, his voice low but determined, "I need your help. I need to teach Betty a lesson. And I need something extreme." Marcus, ever the prankster, chuckled. "What's going on, man?" Drew explained the situation, outlining how Betty had been using his pool whenever she pleased, completely disregarding his requests to stay away. As he spoke, he could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he knew he had to stay calm to make this plan work. He was done being the nice guy. "All right, I got you," Marcus replied. "I'll bring over something that'll make her think twice." A few days later, Marcus showed up at Drew's house with a massive cage and a lifelike alligator prop. Drew wasn't entirely sure what he was expecting, but when he saw the alligator, he felt a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The reptile looked incredibly real, with its menacing eyes and scaly skin. This was the perfect solution. Drew knew that Betty, with all her entitlement and arrogance, would never see it coming. Together, Drew and Marcus set up the scene. They positioned the cage in the corner of the backyard, just near the pool, making sure Betty wouldn't be able to spot it from her usual lounging spot. Drew's heart raced with anticipation as they prepped the area. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do, but the idea of Betty being taught a lesson gave him a sense of empowerment. That evening, as the sun began to set, Drew noticed Betty heading toward his pool once again. This time, he was ready. Drew waited silently in the shadows, watching as Betty confidently made her way into the water. She didn't even glance around, completely unaware that the tables were about to turn. Drew could feel his pulse quicken as he watched her. His eyes locked on the cage where the alligator lay in wait. The moment had come. He held his breath as Betty splashed around in the pool, oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. Drew gave Marcus a subtle signal, and with that, the prank was set into motion. The alligator's tail slowly began to appear from the shadows of the cage, just barely visible. Drew held his breath, waiting for the inevitable reaction. And then Betty saw it. Her eyes widened in terror as she locked onto the alligator, frozen in fear. It took her a second to process what she was seeing, but once it clicked, her panic was instant. She let out a blood-curdling scream and bolted from the pool, tripping over herself in her desperate scramble to get away. Drew watched, barely able to suppress a grin. It was over. Betty had finally gotten the wake-up call she deserved. The day Drew had been waiting for finally arrived. He watched from his kitchen window as Betty confidently strutted toward his pool, the same smug attitude plastered across her face. Drew felt his heart race as he slipped into position. He had prepared for this moment carefully, and everything was in place. The alligator was hidden in its cage, just out of Betty's line of sight, waiting for its moment to strike. Drew had never been one for confrontation, but this was different. He couldn't let Betty continue to disrespect his boundaries, his home. Her constant presence in his pool, the way she'd waltz in without a care in the world, had worn him down. This was his chance to show her what happens when you take advantage of people. He took a deep breath and silently signaled to Marcus, who was watching from the corner of the yard, hidden from Betty's view. Drew then casually stepped outside, trying to act normal. Betty was already in the pool, her back turned to him as she splashed around, completely unaware of the trap set in place. Drew approached her slowly, making sure his footsteps were quiet. He didn't want to give her any reason to suspect something was wrong. When he was within earshot, he spoke. "Betty, do you see that over there?" he said casually, nodding toward the cage. Betty turned her head, and her gaze followed Drew's finger as it pointed toward the cage. The second her eyes locked onto the alligator's tail, it was as if the world slowed down. She blinked, taking in the sight. Then her brain caught up. The alligator's eyes were cold and unblinking, and its massive body was unmistakable. Betty froze, her face drained of color as she took a few shaky steps back. Drew watched, his pulse quickening with anticipation, as her shock gave way to panic. "Is that real?" she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. Before Drew could even reply, Betty let out a horrified scream that shattered the stillness of the evening. Her body shot out of the pool like a bolt of lightning, a blur of flailing limbs as she scrambled to escape. In her frantic rush, she slipped on the wet tiles, tumbling to the ground in a heap. Drew couldn't help but suppress a small grin as she finally managed to right herself, still shrieking as she bolted for the safety of her house. The sight of Betty, usually so self-assured and untouchable, scrambling in terror was sweet satisfaction for Drew. It was the first time in a long while he had felt in control. She had crossed a line, and now she had learned the hard way that there were consequences to her entitled actions. He stood there, watching her retreat, realizing how satisfying it was to see her panic. She wasn't the powerful, untouchable figure she thought she was. In that moment, Betty was just another person, terrified and vulnerable, exactly how Drew had felt every time she had disregarded his privacy. This time, the power had shifted, and it felt good. But Drew's satisfaction was short-lived. The following days saw a new side of Betty. Her ego was bruised, and her reputation in the neighborhood had taken a hit. Drew's prank, though humorous in the moment, had triggered something in Betty, a desire for revenge. She wasn't about to let some nobody in the neighborhood take her down like that. Betty, the woman who had always used her position within the HOA to manipulate others, was not one to back down easily. Her first step was to use the HOA to her advantage once again, but this time it wasn't about the pool. No, she aimed higher, much higher. With her bruised pride and anger clouding her judgment, Betty went straight to the HOA board with a new request. She wanted Drew's house bulldozed. Her reasoning? He was disrupting the peace of the neighborhood with his wild and unsafe behavior. The audacity was staggering, but Betty truly believed her influence in the HOA would grant her the power to destroy Drew's home. When Drew received word that Betty had made such a request, his stomach dropped. He couldn't believe it. She was going too far, trying to take away the home he had worked so hard for. But rather than succumb to fear, Drew stood tall. He knew he had to act fast to prevent her from succeeding. He immediately began gathering evidence. Every complaint Betty had made about him, every slur she had thrown his way, every instance of her abusing her position. Drew had kept a record of her harassment, and now it was time to put it to good use. He knew the HOA couldn't ignore the truth once it was laid out clearly in front of them. Drew presented his case to the HOA, pointing out how Betty had been using her position for personal gain and how her actions toward him had crossed the line into harassment. He included copies of his complaints, detailing the racist slurs she had used against him and how she had unjustly threatened him. The HOA board, after reviewing everything, was left with no choice but to reject Betty's request to bulldoze Drew's house. The decision was a massive blow to Betty. Her once unshakable position in the HOA had been stripped away in a matter of days. Drew watched from the sidelines as Betty tried to manipulate the situation, but her influence had evaporated. She no longer had the power to intimidate or control. Drew had turned the tables on her, and now she was the one who had to face the consequences. The HOA not only rejected her request, but they also conducted a thorough review of Betty's actions, finding her guilty of abusing her position. As a result, they decided to take further action. She would be removed from her position within the HOA. Drew had managed to not only protect his home but also strip Betty of the power she had once wielded with such arrogance. Betty's sense of entitlement had led her to make one too many enemies, and now she was left scrambling to figure out how to get her power back. The tables had turned, and Drew had emerged victorious, proving that standing up for yourself could make all the difference. As the days passed, Drew's sense of vindication continued to grow. He had not only protected his property and dignity, but he had also exposed Betty for the manipulative, entitled person she truly was. However, the consequences of Betty's actions didn't stop with the rejection of her bulldozer request. The weight of her past behavior was about to come crashing down on her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Drew had kept track of every instance Betty had crossed the line. He wasn't one to be quiet when it came to racism or discrimination. After all, she hadn't just violated his boundaries, she had insulted his very identity. Her racist slurs were often subtle, disguised under layers of false politeness. But Drew had heard enough, and when he reported these incidents to the HOA, he provided the evidence they needed to take action. It wasn't long before Betty's behavior caught up with her. The HOA, already fed up with her entitlement and manipulation, finally took notice of the full extent of her actions. When they reviewed Drew's complaints, along with the numerous reports of Betty's discriminatory remarks, they realized that they could no longer allow her to continue to hold power over the community. The truth about Betty's behavior was now undeniable. In an emergency meeting, The HLA board made the decision to remove Betty from her position. Her history of abuse, her harassment of Drew, and her offensive language were too much to overlook. As the board made their announcement, Betty's face turned pale, a stark contrast to the smugness she once carried. Her privilege, her golden ticket to controlling those around her, was no more. She tried to protest, to argue that her influence within the HOA had been justified, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The board had heard enough. With no one to defend her, Betty was unceremoniously fired, her power crumbling as quickly as it had been built. Her reputation, once solid within the HOA, now lay in tatters, and she was forced to face the consequences of her actions. Betty, a woman who had once felt untouchable, now found herself with no position, no influence, and no power. She had spent years using the HOA to control her neighbors, to intimidate them into submission, but now she was the one being controlled. The harsh reality of her situation was hard to ignore. Drew had taught her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. No one is above the consequences of their actions. Despite the crushing blow to her ego and her position in the HOA, Betty wasn't finished. She had always believed she could get what she wanted through sheer force of will, and this time, she wasn't going to let Drew's victory over her go unchecked. Her desperation led her to hatch one final scheme: sneak into Drew's backyard and use his pool again, hoping to regain the sense of control she had lost. Late one afternoon, Drew looked out his window and saw Betty approaching his pool again. Her gaze was furtive, her actions calculated. She believed that, after everything that had happened, she could simply waltz back into his life and use his pool without facing any consequences. Drew's blood ran cold. She hadn't learned a thing. He watched as Betty confidently climbed over the fence, slipping past the gate with practiced ease. Drew's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of certainty that this would be her last attempt. This time, there would be no escape for her. Quickly, Drew grabbed his phone and dialed the authorities. He had already learned from his past experiences with Betty that she needed to be held accountable, no matter how small the infraction. As he waited for the police to arrive, Drew couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. This was it. Betty had crossed the line one too many times, and now she would face the consequences of her entitlement. Minutes later, Drew watched as the police arrived, the sirens cutting through the calm evening air. Betty, caught in the act, tried to defend herself, but it was clear her influence no longer carried weight. The officers, armed with Drew's report of her trespassing and harassment, wasted no time in placing her under arrest. As Betty was handcuffed and led away, she glared at Drew, her face twisted in disbelief. She had always thought herself untouchable, but now she was nothing more than a criminal being carted off to face the law. Drew stood on his porch, a sense of finality settling over him. He had not only protected his property and his peace, but had also made it clear that disrespect and abuse of power would never go unchecked. The justice that had eluded him for so long had finally come full circle, and in the end, Drew emerged victorious. As Betty was driven away in the back of the police car, Drew's thoughts were clear. He had fought back against a neighbor who had tried to use her power to trample over him. In doing so, he had reminded everyone in the neighborhood that entitlement and privilege would never trump justice. Drew's patience, persistence, and careful planning had paid off, and Betty's reign of arrogance had ended.